topics, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you, Nick.
Can you tell everyone a little bit about who you are and what your lab studies?
Sure. Yeah. So, I'm Thomas Weimbs. I'm a professor of molecular, cellular, and developmental biology at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And we study primarily a genetic kidney disease called polycystic kidney disease, or PKD.
Okay, we'll get into that disease and stuff quite a bit, I think. But I've never really done any podcast that's had directly to do with the kidneys or the kidney, just kidney biology. And so I want to start out with just some basics on kidney biology. A lot of people will have some general vague, like me, will have some general, pretty vague sense of what the kidney does. It's involved in filtration. But, how well would you say we understand the kidney as an organ? Is it an organ that's considered to be sort of fully solved or fairly well understood, or is it still quite mysterious in certain ways?
Well, I would say, scientists, have studied it for a long, long time. And obviously, there is a whole discipline called nephrology out there, the kidney doctors. I would say there's a lot of mysteries, but there shouldn't have to be mysteries. So it's, for example, chronic kidney disease, often just called kidney disease, in lay terms. Turns out it's the number one non-communicable disease by prevalence. So that's ahead of cancer, ahead of cardiovascular disease, ahead of type 2 diabetes.
Wow.
So in the US, there's about 14% of the population affected by kidney disease. So it's a pretty insane number. So we're talking 40 plus million people.
Well, more than 1 in 10 people has chronic kidney disease.
Yeah. So worldwide, it's over 10%. In the US, it's a little more. It's 14%. So the mystery is, to me, not much of a mystery. But for some reason, for everyone, for doctors, it seems to be a bit of a mystery. How does this come all about? What do we do about it? And the numbers have just going up and up and up. So clearly. The treatment is not doing what it should be doing, so it's only gotten worse.
Yeah, I suspect maybe there's some foreshadowing happening here. Maybe it's just another example of where, when we treat things, we're often treating the symptoms, some of the endpoints of the disease, rather than addressing what's actually causing the disease and removing that. Before we dive into all of that stuff, can you just give us a basic, concise overview of the major known functions of the kidney? How does it do what it does, and how does it work?
Sure. Yes. Yeah. So we all have two kidneys, almost everyone. And they're essentially, the most basic function of the kidneys is to make sure our blood gets purified constantly. So 24/7, the kidneys just essentially filter the blood, and they do it in a way where essentially everything, all the small molecules get filtered out first, and then the kidney decides what to keep and what to reabsorb again. So, for example, waste products, metabolic waste products, the kidney just gets rid of. But something like sugar, amino acids, things that we actually want to keep, they get filtered first, and then the kidney decides, oh, wait, here's sugar. Let's keep that and let's not pee it out. Here's an amino acid. Let's, keep that. And the end product is, of course, the urine that we excrete, and then which means with the urine we get rid of a lot of the waste products. And in the whole process, the kidney also regulates, the homeostasis, so essentially the balancing of, many of the components that we need, to live. Water homeostasis. Right? Obviously, if we're in the desert, wandering around and haven't had a drink in a day or so, the kidneys try their very best to conserve water and not pee out anything. If we're drinking like crazy, obviously the kidney has to get rid of a lot of the water. That's just an example. And the same applies to things like sodium, potassium, essentially all of the electrolytes. They're essentially all handled by the kidneys, and the kidney decides, oh, I have too much sodium, let's pee some out, or we have too little sodium, let's retain it. So that's in a nutshell what the kidneys do. So if they would fail, however, obviously everything goes out of whack, and very quickly we would die.
Mm-hmm. So the kidneys are filtering our blood. Obviously, the blood, the cardiovascular system, we're pumping blood all throughout our bodies in order to transport electrolytes, to transport oxygen, macronutrients, micronutrients. And we want all of these things to get all over the body, but we want to make sure we don't have too much or too little of some of these things. And we also want to filter out things that shouldn't be there in the first place, like small molecules or toxins and things like this. Is that more or less how to think about it?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And to what extent is the kidney hooked up and working in parallel with like the liver? So, is the kidney filtering out certain toxins, but certain other toxins go to the liver? Like when we want to get out like synthetic compounds, environmental contaminants, things like that, how does the liver stack up relative to the kidney?
Right. Yeah. So both organs, the liver and the kidney, are sort of detoxification organs, and that's part of their function. Basically, you could say that the liver is more in charge of detoxifying lipophilic compounds, things that are essentially fat soluble. And the kidney is more in charge of getting rid of hydrophilic compounds, water soluble things. And it just has to do with the nature of, the urine versus the bile, essentially, and things like that. But often there's a bit of a crosstalk, because sometimes a lipophilic toxin can get processed by the liver first and turned into something hydrophilic that then the liver spits back out into the bloodstream. Then it goes into the kidney. The kidney says, whoa, this is a toxin, let's get rid of it. So there's collaboration going on, if you will.
But as a general rule, the kidney is filtering out water soluble stuff from the blood, and the liver is detoxifying fat soluble stuff as a general rule. Is another difference there that like when the liver detoxes something, there's actual sort of enzymatic transformation of chemicals, whereas it sounds like maybe the kidney is not necessarily chemically transforming things, but filtering them out and putting them into the urine instead.
Yeah, I would say that's basically correct. Yeah.
And then, so we all have two kidneys. Is there anything, what should we know about like kidney anatomy? Are there like specialized compartments that do different things? What are sort of the major pieces of each kidney?
Right. Yeah, so each kidney is made up out of subunits that are called nephrons. So the human kidney each has about 1 million nephrons. So they're obviously tiny, microscopic, and each nephron is essentially a tubule, right? So like a small little tube. It has, a beginning and an end. The beginning of the tube is a structure called the glomerulus, which is where the blood essentially comes in, right? So it's a vascular system. And that's where the filtration happens. Once the blood comes in, it gets pressed through a sieve, if you will. And then the fluid enters the beginning of the tubule. It moves all the way along the tubule. And that's where all the processing happens. The good and the bad get separated. And then at the end, each tubule ends in a collecting duct, which then eventually leads to the bladder. And, that's how we pee it all out. So those are the basic units. So we're born, with about like 1 million nephrons in each kidney. And the goal is we want to keep as many happy as for our lifetime as we can, because they don't come back. They don't we cannot produce new nephrons if some get damaged.
I see. So that's different. So that's kind of similar to the brain. Like we can't regrow parts of our damaged brain. We can't regrow these nephrons, these subunits of the kidney. So I would imagine just naturally over time as we age, some of them start to fail. And we've sort of got, I guess you could think of why do we have a million of them? It's sort of like a lot of backup systems. And eventually I would imagine enough of them get damaged that the kidney as a whole is no longer filtering things properly. And that's when you can start to run into chronic problems.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And in fact, even a perfectly healthy individual, you are going to lose some nephrons, here and there. And it's just an age-related consequence, of aging, that our kidney function slowly declines a little bit. If somebody's like, very old age, and they have 60% kidney function, that's actually considered completely normal. So that's not a cause of concern. But of course, if you're young and you're left with only 60% kidney function, that would be a cause for concern, because it's only going to go downhill from there.
I see. So your total blood filtration capacity is basically the number of healthy nephrons you have across both kidneys. And I suppose this is why you can often afford to lose one of them if you want to donate your kidney to someone. And even though that won't kill you or anything, it'll decrease your sort of lifetime capacity for filtration.
Yes, to a certain extent. However, interestingly, the kidneys can actually adjust and can. So let's say you donate a kidney or you lose a kidney for some reason. The remaining kidney actually grows in size. It doesn't grow new nephrons. Everything just becomes a little bit bigger. So it's called hypertrophy. So the whole kidney enhances its capacity to filter more. There's actually some compensation then going on. That's why it's actually all right to donate a kidney. It's not that you suddenly are left with only 50% kidney function, because the remaining kidney cranks things up and tries to make up.
You can't grow a new kidney, but your other kidney will get bigger. So like the processing capacity of each processor of the kidney will actually get a boost.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow. Interesting. And so I would imagine, what are some of the common ways that kidney function can be temporarily compromised? Are states of can you go into states of dehydration or electrolyte overload that kind of temporarily throw it off and mess with your urine composition or something like that?
Yes, for sure. That can happen. That's called acute kidney injury. And there's 1,000 reasons why that could happen. A simple way of thinking about it is a nephrotoxin, right? So you accidentally ingest something that is a nephrotoxin and starts, because many toxins go through the kidney, by necessity, because they need to get filtered out, so they can get concentrated in the kidney and really affect kidneys more than other organs. If that toxin starts killing kidney cells, you end up with acute kidney injury. That can be dramatic. Your kidney function can go down to essentially nothing, which means somebody might need to go on emergency dialysis, to make up for it and in order to survive. But oftentimes the kidneys can actually recover from acute kidney injury. The kidney has innate mechanisms to repair itself. So there can be new proliferation going on of these kidney tubule cells, and they essentially start replacing the ones that were lost. So acute kidney injury, can definitely happen, and oftentimes is recoverable. It can also, a common cause is, for example, during what's called ischemic events, during surgeries. But if somebody has a cardiac surgery, it's quite common that the kidneys are affected because the blood supply is compromised temporarily during the surgery, and you end up with acute kidney injury. And it may not be a big problem because, you just essentially, wait for the kidneys to come back up.
Mm-hmm. And what is the direct immediate source of the blood into the kidney? What is that what is that vessel and where is it getting the blood from? I would imagine this has to be blood as much as possible that's not already gone through general circulation. It's probably trying to get piped in the kidney shortly after the gut is absorbing nutrients and things like that.
I'm not the world's best anatomist, but I think it's actually just a regular artery that goes into the kidney, and it has probably to do with the 24/7 mechanism. The kidneys are always working, right? So they don't just kick in after you consume anything. They just keep filtering. So it's just a constant,
just
flow.
Constant plug into direct to general circulation.
Right. Yeah.
And so the kidney is dealing with the world of water soluble stuff primarily. So it's going to affect electrolyte levels in your blood and your urine. It's going to affect, filtering out toxins, for example. When we think about toxins, water soluble toxins that the kidney is filtering out, how does the kidney know when something is a toxin and when it's supposed to be circulating?
Yeah. So there's many different complicated mechanisms, and the basic principle is usually that everything, just as I mentioned before, everything gets filtered, in the beginning of the tubule, and then the kidney essentially just recovers what it wants. It works sort of like almost in reverse, but it gets, by default, it gets rid of everything, and then recognizes specific things, let's say glucose, right? So there's a glucose transporter that says, oh, you are glucose. Let me bring you back into the, through the epithelium, into the blood. So it's not as much that toxins get specifically secreted, they essentially get secreted by default, through the filtering process, but then they're not being recovered because they're not recognized as useful.
That actually makes sense. It's a pretty elegant way for the system to have evolved, because if it had to individually recognize all of the toxin things you don't want, there's who knows how many, an effectively infinite number of those things. There's sort of no way to bake all of that complexity in. But if you're just filtering everything out by default, then you've got a finite number of things that the body is pre-programmed to know should go through glucose, et cetera.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. And, one thing, fortunately, I've never experienced this, but it's fairly common. You can tell us how common it is, but people talk about kidney stones and how painful they are. What exactly are kidney stones and what causes them?
Yeah, so kidney stones are fairly common, and they have been getting more common, in past decades. So what are kidney stones? So the kidney, as it, does its filtering business, and, excreting of waste products, it also concentrates the urine, what becomes the urine, right? So you start with a large volume, as the kidney filters, and, obviously you don't want to lose all the water because you would dehydrate very, very quickly. So the kidney then needs to recover a lot of the water, which means the solutes that are, to be excreted, they get more and more concentrated over time, as it passes through the kidney. And unfortunately, some of the solutes have the tendency to be not very soluble, which means that along the way, they hit the supersaturation threshold, and they start to crystallize inside the kidney tubule, and that's what leads to microcrystal formation in these tubules. So that's something we have actually studied in the lab. The most common form of kidney stone in humans is calcium oxalate kidney stones. So that's like by far the most common. And the molecule calcium oxalate, so it's just, like when calcium meets oxalate, they get together, and that happens to be poorly soluble. And in the once it's concentrated in the kidney, it can crystallize out. And these crystals are, maybe like, say, a micrometer in diameter initially, so they're tiny, microscopic. But they can be very damaging, and they look like little shards of glass, right? So they have like edges, and they like to get stuck in those kidney tubules.
So kidney stone is literally a tiny crystal, and it has to eventually somehow pass through the system of tubes that comprises the kidney, all the way through your urethra.
Yeah, it's not yet. So the microcrystal, I would say, is a precursor to a kidney stone.
I see. So like a bunch of them aggregate together.
Exactly right. So if the kidney somehow is overwhelmed with too much calcium oxalate, forms too many of these microcrystals that can get stuck, that can aggregate. And a big question is, how does the kidney get rid of them? That's actually something we have studied, and I'm happy to tell you all about it. It's a very cool mechanism. But basically, if the kidney fails to get rid of them, they just keep accumulating, they bunch together, and they form bigger and bigger, crystals. So, which eventually becomes a kidney stone, and then that can cause big problems.
Yeah. So it sounds like multiple things need to happen. These microcrystals need to form to begin with. So you need to have calcium meeting oxalates to create calcium oxalate. You probably then have to form a number of these microcrystals. And then the kidney has to fail to get rid of them fast enough so that they can accumulate and aggregate together. And then you've got a kidney stone, which is going to cause you actual symptoms and actual problems. So let's start at the very beginning. If the microcrystals are calcium oxalate, calcium, we get calcium in our diet. Everybody knows that. It's an ion. It's going to be water soluble, pretty straightforward to think about. Calcium is used for all sorts of stuff throughout the body. It reacts with these things called oxalates. What are those and where do they come from?
Yeah, so oxalate is a normal metabolic waste product that we make day in, day out. And, it comes from things like hydroxyproline, which is in our collagen, for example, and a few other compounds that get metabolized to oxalate. And the body cannot degrade oxalate any further. So you have to pee it out. You have to get rid of it, mostly for the kidney. And usually the endogenous production of oxalate is not a problem. The kidneys have evolved to deal with that. The problem comes in if we also eat a lot of oxalate with our food or ingest it. Where does oxalate come from in nature? It actually comes from plants. So many plants use oxalate essentially as a defense, as a poison. Because plants, it turns out, they don't want to be eaten, most of them. So they try to be toxic to animals that want to eat them, let's say humans. So if you go out in nature and, start eating like 100 different species of plants, probably 95 of them will eventually kill you if you eat enough of it. So usually plants are very toxic. Only very few plants, have become food for us humans, but they still do contain oxalate, just, like lower amounts. But some are still off the charts, things like spinach, for example. That's probably the most common one that can cause oxalate problems. So spinach contains a huge amount of oxalate. I would consider it a non-edible toxic plant, actually. So I'm not quite sure why it is allowed to be in our food supply. But yep. So you can absolutely overeat on, say, spinach, and some people like to make like spinach smoothies or spinach juice or something.
That would probably actually just increase the bioavailability of the oxalates.
Oh yes, right. So, and there are many case reports in the literature where somebody consumed a few too many spinach juices and ends up with acute kidney injury, what we talked about before. And they're in the hospital, and sometimes they might even lose their kidneys that way.
So Popeye the Sailor Man probably had kidney stones.
Very possible. Right.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, so the oxalates are essentially, they're in most plants to some level. Many plants have them at very high levels, and they sort of have them for the reason of defense. They actually don't want, most plants don't want to be eaten most of the time. And if they are eaten by herbivores, herbivores are animals that probably have evolved special adaptations to detox these plants in certain ways. And so in a species like ours, which doesn't have those detox mechanisms, you can run into problems by consuming plants with high levels of things like oxalates. And It sounds like you said, basically, there's the things that we consider edible vegetables represent, a tiny slice of the plant world that just doesn't have especially high levels of things like oxalates and presumably a lot of other things. But you're saying in one case, spinach, we do commonly think of this as an edible food plant, but what you're saying is it actually has high enough levels of oxalates that you think that's basically a mistake?
Yeah, I would probably say so, and especially since spinach is promoted as a healthy food, and you see it on the internet all day long. A nephrologist friend of mine told me once that he had a patient who heard on the internet that spinach is good for your health. So she said, all right, if a little bit of spinach is good for your health, more spinach is more good for your health. So you eat spinach all day long. And that person then, showed up at the, in the nephrology clinic with acute kidney injury. And that happens with other foods as well. Many nuts are very high in oxalate, almonds, peanuts, for example.
Really?
Another nephrologist friend told me of a person who was binge eating peanuts, which is very easy to do because it tastes so good, right?
Yeah.
And you end up with acute kidney injury potentially.
Yeah, the more I've learned about nutrients and toxins and bioavailability across foods over the years, the more I realize how backwards thinking often is. So for example, just to take the case of peanuts, you're saying not only do they contain oxalates, so if you eat more peanuts, you're going to have more oxalates and a higher chance of getting kidney stones. But people, for example, think of peanuts as a good source of protein. And while they contain a lot of protein, it's not very bioavailable. So there's a lot of people out there eating peanuts, not realizing that they're getting oxalates, which will promote kidney stones, and thinking falsely that they're getting a lot of protein when in fact they're only getting a fraction of what's inside of it.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. Any other common foods that have like fairly high levels of oxalates that maybe people should know about besides spinach?
Yeah, so things like rhubarb, that's not so common in the US, but in I'm from Germany. When I was a kid, I loved to eat rhubarb. When it's rhubarb season, that's pretty high in oxalate. Things like dragon fruit, and many essentially. I think I would say by default, you would want to suspect that something is high in oxalates. There's actually like tables of oxalate content of different foods. So it's a good idea. If somebody has kidney stone problem, you probably want to look at a list like that and maybe flag for yourself the things that are kind of very high in oxalate and say, oh, okay, let me stay away from those.
Yeah. But it's based on everything you've said so far. Obviously, some things have higher levels of oxalates, like spinach, but it sounds like most plants or a high percentage of plants are going to have some amount of oxalates.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, things like Swiss chard, for example, again promoted as a health food. It's also very high. Yeah, and then that's why juicing may be a bad idea for many people, right? Especially juicing, because you end up you start with a large amount of spinach, whatever it is, and you condense it down to a tiny little drink. You gulp it down
all at once.
Right, and maybe you have another one after that. So the intake can be quite high.
Wow. And so, inevitably, right, there's going to be people out there who've had kidney stones, people who will get kidney stones. Let's say you're one of these people, you're consuming a little bit too much of the oxalates from different plant foods like spinach. These microcrystals start to form. Calcium and oxalates form calcium oxalate. They start to form, and then they start aggregating. So the kidney's failing to get rid of these things, failing to clear them out. What is causing that?
Yeah, so that's something we have researched, and it used to be pretty mysterious, how the kidney gets rid of these microcrystals, right? So everybody knows, they do form, and they actually do show up in the urine. And that's called crystalluria, right? So if somebody has, lots and lots of crystals in the urine, that's called crystalluria, and pretty much every normal person even pees out millions of these microcrystals every day with the urine. So it's kind of how the kidney gets rid of them. And as long as they stay small enough and they get excreted quickly enough with the kidneys, they don't really pose any danger. But every once in a while they do aggregate, and the kidney gets overwhelmed and they get lodged in those kidney tubules. And it was actually unknown how the kidney deals with that, with these initial kind of like blockages of crystals. So we published a paper back in 2019 where we actually figured out how this works. And it's a I think, a brilliant move of evolution. What we found is that, once a kidney tubule is blocked with like an aggregate of crystals, the plumbing essentially widens, right? So the tubule, has usually a very small diameter, but with a crystal stuck in them, the tubule just gets much bigger, right? So you get a, doubling, tripling or so of the tubule diameter, and that allows that tubule to flush out the crystal and get rid of it. And then after about a week or so, the tubule is back to the normal diameter. So it will reestablish its diameter. And that is actually controlled by signaling pathways in those kidney tubule epithelial cells. And if you block them, for example, the tubule cannot widen, and you get worse. You will get worse crystal burden, and the kidney cannot excrete them. So it's almost like in your house, your kitchen sink, is connected to the plumbing. You put too much grease and coffee grinds down there, it gets stuck eventually. If you had really smart plumbing, the plumbing would just widen and let you just flush it all the way out. And unfortunately, our plumbing is stuck, at one diameter, but the kidney has solved that problem.
I see. Wow. Yeah. So it can just dynamically adjust its size.
Right. Yeah. And for some reason that hadn't been realized before. And that also then tied in to this whole problem of polycystic kidney disease that we can get into later. But we think that's actually kind of what is causing these cysts to form.
And when someone has like full-blown kidney stones and they talk about having to pass the stones, how are they normally removed if someone has to go into the doctor? Are there procedures that can be done to go in and like disintegrate the crystals, or do they have to like let it pass all the way out of their body?
Yeah, it totally depends, how big the stone is and where it is stuck. So sometimes, if it's too big, yes. So with ultrasound, that can be essentially broken into tiny pieces. Sometimes if that's not possible, they might have to go in surgically to remove a kidney stone. But the best way is always preventing it from happening in the first place. And usually when somebody has had a kidney stone, I've never had one, luckily, but I've heard, bad stories about how painful this is, and people compare it to, a woman giving birth, the same level of pain. So I think people that had kidney stones are highly motivated not to get another one. And prevent them.
Yeah. So basically, prevention here is basically about avoiding oxalate-containing foods.
So that's one way, and it depends a little bit. So there are some kidney stones that are not made up of oxalates. So another class is calcium phosphate, and another one is uric acid. There are kind of two other somewhat common ones, but most of them is calcium oxalate. So if someone is a calcium oxalate stone former, definitely they would reduce the intake of oxalate. You can also actually increase the intake of calcium with your food. And that sounds counterintuitive, but you'd think, oh, wait a second, eating more calcium, shouldn't that give me more calcium kidney stones? But actually the opposite is the case, because the calcium that you ingest with your food, let's say from a dairy product, you eat some yogurt with your spinach, the calcium from the food will actually bind to the oxalate from the spinach.
Preemptively bind to it before it gets inside.
Exactly. So it gets essentially neutralized in the GI tract, and you just get rid of it harmlessly.
I see.
So that's a way of preventing it.
I see. So if you really love peanuts or spinach or stuff with oxalates, or let's say you're a vegetarian or a vegan and it's harder to avoid eating high oxalate levels, if you are just careful about co-consuming high calcium foods with high oxalate foods, that can help solve the problem.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. That's exactly right. And the number one recommendation to prevent any kidney stone of any chemical composition is just to drink more water. Because that will always keep things more diluted in the kidney, and prevent this supersaturation problem for any type of kidney stone. And that's the number one recommendation for anyone to prevent kidney stones. Just drink more water. lots of people don't like to drink more water, and that can be a challenge. But something like 2 or 3 liters a day, is usually kind of the recommendation there.
I see. So the stack of recommendations here to minimize kidney stone, the probability of getting kidney stones, stay hydrated with plenty of water, avoid oxalates as much as possible, and or consume high enough levels of calcium together with foods that contain oxalates.
Yeah, exactly.
What about, are there any like food components or toxins or chemicals that are particularly problematic for the kidney that can damage the kidney? Like, by analogy, we often talk about liver or liver damage. Like if you drink a lot of alcohol, this is really hard on your liver in particular because the liver is what's detoxing the alcohol. Are there any common things in foods or in medications or anything like that people are exposed to that is especially problematic for the kidneys?
Right, yeah. I would say number one is probably anything that can form microcrystals in the kidney. We talked about the oxalate, another one is phosphate, for example, calcium phosphate. And unfortunately, ultra-processed foods contain a lot of inorganic phosphate food additives. And they're not added for nutritional value. They're just added for, industrially processing value, essentially to make it more your food's more, palatable or as a preservative and things like that. So they're in there for the wrong reasons. And the inorganic food additives, they actually get absorbed much more than, phosphate that comes with meat, for example. So you end up with a high phosphate load that has to get through the kidney, can give you calcium phosphate kidney stones. Another source is actually uric acid. So that's not something you eat, but the uric acid is sort of a metabolic consequence most of the time of eating too much fructose, right? So the sugar fructose, and fructose is like half of the table sugar. Sucrose is actually fructose. So every time you eat 100 grams of table sugar, you're actually eating 50 grams of fructose. And the way that fructose is metabolized in the body, that actually leads to the generation of uric acid by the liver. And that's a problem because all that uric acid has to be excreted through the kidneys. And uric acid is another one of these compounds that are, tend to be highly insoluble and can quickly overwhelm the kidney. So we can end up with uric acid microcrystals. That's also something we are studying in the lab, how these microcrystals can really injure the kidneys quite dramatically. So we see, like strong inflammatory pathways turning up and so on.
I see. So the uric acid can become a problem with respect to the kidneys and the formation of kidney stones, ultimately for the same physiochemical reason that the oxalates were a problem. You're forming you're forming something that's not quite as soluble as you would like, and so these microcrystals can precipitate out of solution and then ultimately lead to kidney stones.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you're. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say a whole other class are medications, drugs, because many of them, oftentimes, a very common side effect of many drugs is nephrotoxicity, and even something over the counter, very simple, ibuprofen, for example, right? So, everyone has that probably in their household, in their cabinet, their medicine cabinet. You don't think twice about it. You got some back pain, you pop some ibuprofen, and you got more back pain, you pop more. It's actually quite nephrotoxic, and many cases of acute kidney injury from ibuprofen, overconsumption, and that can also lead to chronic kidney disease. And so you essentially progress and might lose your kidney function that way.
Is that ibuprofen specifically, or is it that class of drugs generally?
It's a whole class, but maybe ibuprofen might be the most common one that people just have around the house. Unfortunately, I don't think there's any big warnings on the labels. Not that I've seen. You buy the stuff like a 500 pill bottle at Costco, for example. That's where I get it from. And I've never seen a warning label saying, "Oh, you can get, kidney toxicity from it."
Wow. Yeah. So one possible title for this podcast is why you should stop taking ibuprofen and eating spinach.
There you go.
So what
Right.
is it about? I mean, we don't need to go into like gory mechanistic detail, but is ibuprofen, are drugs that are nephrotoxins like ibuprofen, are they basically just slowly but surely destroying the nephrons, the processing units of the kidney?
Right. Yeah, that's basically it. Yeah. There's even some drugs that also form crystals again. We're back to the crystals. I've heard this from let's see, vancomycin, one of the common antibiotics that are administered in hospitals, that also has a pretty high rate of acute kidney injury. And that can actually precipitate, because that has to be eliminated for the kidneys. And in fact, many of those drugs that have nephrotoxicity, they particularly impact the kidneys because they get essentially concentrated in the kidney during the detoxification.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Wow. So the uric acid is one of the things like oxalates that can cause these little crystals to form and eventually give you kidney stones. The uric acid one's interesting because you're saying it's a byproduct of fructose metabolism. And so one of the problems of the uric acid here that's coming from fructose is what you mentioned. It's the ability to form these little crystals and then kidney stones. But I've heard that, it's problematic for other reasons as well. I've read and I've had people on the podcast who talk about the sort of metabolic chain of events that happens, taking you from fructose to uric acid. And then, there's the case you just talked about with the kidney stuff, but there's also, it can basically go another direction and basically promote things like fatty liver.
Yeah, absolutely. And if maybe you've had Rick Johnson on your podcast, if you haven't, he's a great guy to invite. So he has done all the research on how fructose and uric acid and how this leads to metabolic diseases and so on. We're actually collaborating with him as well on a project. And yes, uric acid is bad in the sense of it really triggers a whole metabolic change in the body, and which probably has like ancient evolutionary reasons. When it used to be a good thing, when we were hunter-gatherers and we had to gorge ourselves on fruit, for example, just before the winter comes, so we can fatten up. So there's a whole switch that actually makes us become fat for good reasons. But of course, nowadays, it doesn't matter anymore if it's winter or summer. We have food available any day of the week. So if we keep consuming all that fructose constantly, we keep triggering this fat switch, and we're just accumulating body fat that way.
Yeah, I've heard this type of idea articulated before by others that, obviously not only do total calorie consumption that matters, total sugar consumption matters, but also things like the glucose fructose ratio can tip the body down different metabolic pathways. And it could very well be that I think what you're saying is that in the past, perhaps due to seasonal changes in food supply that signaled the onset of winter and the need to fatten ourselves up, we may have started consuming things seasonally such that the fructose glucose ratio increases. This promotes fat gain, and that's actually adaptive in the context of seasonality, where starving is a real concern. But in today's world, that starvation is no longer a concern, and everything has high fructose corn syrup in it now.
Exactly, yeah, and that's another very common complication of high uric acid levels is gout. Gout symptoms. Essentially joint problems, where the uric acid actually leads to crystal formation. Again, in this case, it's not the uric acid itself, but it is monosodium urate. So the sodium salt of uric acid, which also happens to be poorly soluble, and that is the one that crystallizes in the joints, in the toes and hands and so on. The gout, used to be called the disease of the kings, because back in the day, only the kings could afford to eat a lot of sugar all day long, and, consume alcohol and so on.
Wow. So oxalates can be a problem. Spinach, peanuts, certain other plant foods, certain medications like ibuprofen can be a problem for the kidneys. High fructose consumption can also be a problem for reasons we just discussed, tied to uric acid. Any other? Let me ask you this: what about other dietary components. So, for example, do certain fatty acids or the total amino acid concentration of your diet matter? I've heard things before in my life where people would say things like very high protein diets where you're consuming a lot of amino acids can be problematic for the kidneys. Is that true?
Well, that's a very old myth, almost, I would say, and that actually originates from a a paper, from the 1980s, I want to say, by a very prominent nephrologist, Barry Brenner. So it's called the Brenner hypothesis, oftentimes, and Barry Brenner went on to write the textbook on nephrology that every single nephrologist in the country has studied. And it's a very interesting story. So it's almost was a theoretical paper, right? So there were some indications from like different species of animals, that yes, if you eat some protein, your kidney filtration goes up. That all makes sense. And Brenner essentially postulated that, if you just to eat more protein, your kidney filtration, goes into overdrive and you hyperfiltrate, and that ultimately would be detrimental to kidneys, and you end up with chronic kidney disease that way. So that was essentially the dogma for many decades, and it has made it into all the clinical guidelines, and oftentimes people with kidney disease are advised, to cut down their protein intake, oftentimes dramatically. The threshold of malnutrition for protein intake is about 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. That's essentially what the government says. You got to be above that. But people with kidney disease often are advised to be below that. And sometimes even like way below that. You might say 0.6 or 0.5 and so on.
All because of this guy. This guy had a hypothesis and he wrote a textbook.
Yeah, yes, yeah. And, there were some studies done, but I think nothing actually ever really proved anything. But it turns out more recent studies have pretty much across the board shown that, protein consumption is not really associated with chronic kidney disease. That as you know, but it takes something like 20 years for studies to make it into clinical practice. So we're still behind there. And unfortunately, still many people with kidney disease are advised to cut down their protein intake, but then they end up with being malnourished. They end up with sarcopenia, muscle wasting, and it actually can cut down the overall mortality. There was a recent paper that looked at patients with chronic kidney disease, that were either on a low protein or normal protein diet, and overall mortality was actually much better. They lived longer on a higher protein diet. So, yeah.
I mean, it's just amazing. It's one more example out of many that we could talk about in the history of medicine in the US, at least, where, we normally like to think that everything that's in clinical practice has sort of gone through this rigorous chain of vetting, going from basic research to clinical research to sort of proven bona fide stuff that's in the textbooks, and then we put it into practice. But not always, but in many cases, there are things that are put into practice that are not only wrong, but they're based on ideas that often can be traced back to a single socially influential person, and that never really had strong evidence to back them to begin with.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that has happened many times. So, most nephrologists, I would say, have actually never really gone back and read this Brenner paper in detail. So I actually went back recently and said, okay, then let's read what exactly is in there, and stumbled on something really interesting. So the whole premise of this hypothetical paper was that ancient humans, during our evolutionary days, when we were hunter-gatherers, that ancestral humans would have consumed food only every 2 days, right? So he just hypothesized, okay, we were on an intermittent fasting regimen pretty much, throughout our lives, and that has to do, with our luck in hunting, not being there every day, and obviously we had no refrigerators, no food pantries, and not constant access to food. So the premise was, okay, ancient people ate every 2 days. and that would have spiked their kidney filtration, intermittently for only 2 days, and then things went back to normal. And then in contrast, modern humans would eat food all day long, which is true, and our kidneys would hyperfiltrate all day long, and that's what's causing chronic kidney disease. So there is probably a lot of truth to some of that premise, because I think that is pretty clear that ancestral humans didn't eat all day long. They didn't have breakfast, lunch, and dinner and snacks in between. So to me, the natural conclusion even of that premise would be that you would treat kidney disease by putting people on an ancestral eating regimen, right? So you would say to a kidney patient,
intermittent fasting.
Exactly right. So that should be the natural conclusion for anyone like you and me, and who can
starting from that premise, that's the conclusion that follows. Yeah, it makes sense.
Yes, exactly right. But that wasn't the conclusion of the paper. The conclusion of the paper was, if we eat protein twice a day, and that's okay. But if we eat protein all day long, and that's not okay, let's just cut down the protein intake. We keep eating it all day long, right? So, and that has become clinical practice to say, okay, eat all day long whatever you want except protein.
That would, in a funny way too, that's also probably going to tend to bias people towards foods that are low in protein, which might more often than not be foods that are high in things like oxalates and other problematic things.
Right, exactly, yeah. Yes. And that actually, so I think the conclusion of this paper could have been great, and could have, the recommendation could have been, all right, you got to be on intermittent fasting if you have kidney disease, or if you go towards, declining kidney function. And of course, what happens if somebody eats only once every 2 days is they will spend half of their life in ketosis, right? And we should probably talk about ketosis quite a bit. And that would actually, so that's some of the major research we've done in my lab is to look at the effect of ketosis on kidney disease. And I think Brenner could have been completely correct if he had just made the logical conclusion and said, you got to be on intermittent fasting. This would have saved us from the epidemic of chronic kidney disease.
Oh, I definitely want to get into that. One last thing I want to ask here, just because I'm fascinated by like the sociology and the psychology. Brenner, why was he hung up about protein specifically? Was there something in his thinking at the time that made him hyper-focus on protein?
Not sure. Clear? I think it came from animal experiments, like in rats and dogs and vampire bats and things like that. You feed these animals different types of foods and figure out which one increases the kidney filtration the most, and just turn out that protein is the one that has the strongest effect. But of course, if we're eating like an ancestrally appropriate diet, protein is one of the components, you can't avoid it. So essentially, anytime you eat food, you do eat protein. So to me, I would actually equate kidney filtration with just eating, basically, right? Yeah. So I wouldn't say, it's just a protein that they have to take care of. It's just the eating, I would say.
Yeah. And, obviously the more you're eating, at least if you're eating carbohydrates, the less you're going to be in ketosis. The more you're fasting or doing something like a ketogenic diet, the more you will be in ketosis. It sounds like there's interesting stuff happening there. I think I can probably guess what some of it is, but why don't you start us off here? What's the connection between the ketogenic diet and kidney health, and how did you even get started down this path?
Yeah. So, so maybe one thing to say first is, that the number one cause of kidney disease is type 2 diabetes, right? So, out of the 40 plus million people in the US with kidney disease, half of them at least have it because of they have type 2 diabetes. Kidney disease is, actually the number one complication of type 2 diabetes that impacts people's lives, right? So everyone is thinking in terms of, the diabetic foot ulcers, you get your feet amputated and so on, or blindness, that you lose your vision, and those are definitely bad things, and they happen. But much more common is chronic kidney disease. So people with diabetes can actually lose their kidney function. They end up on dialysis, and of course, what happens in diabetes is, essentially carbohydrate overconsumption leading to persistent hyperglycemia. So you have persistently high blood glucose levels and all these blood glucose spikes, and that's causing insulin spikes. Those are actually the things that impact the kidneys. So the glucose itself can impact the kidneys and essentially damage blood vessels in the kidneys, leads to glomerular dysfunction. The insulin causes hypertension, and hypertension is actually another cause of kidney damage. So to me, it would seem pretty clear, if you want to diminish the impact of chronic kidney disease, you don't want to recommend to people to eat a high carbohydrate diet all day long, right? Because it can only possibly worsen it. And that's, however, not the thinking in the field. So people are usually not advised to go on a low carb diet. So that hasn't happened yet.
Wow. So it seems like kidney biology and nephrology has a long history of getting things pretty much backwards.
Yes, I think that's very, very true, unfortunately. So the way we stumbled on it in my lab is, so we have been studying a genetic form of kidney disease, of chronic kidney disease, and that's called polycystic kidney disease. So out of of all the cases of chronic kidney disease, about a couple of percent of them are actually have a genetic underpinning, if you will. And the most common form of that is polycystic kidney disease, or PKD. I'm just going to say PKD for short. So, there can be a mutation in one of two different genes, and that leads to polycystic kidney disease. And the dogma in the field of polycystic kidney disease has always been that it's really the gene mutations that drive the disease progression, and essentially patients are told, oh, you got the gene mutations, you're screwed. Sorry, there's nothing you can do. There's no diet or lifestyle that could possibly change anything. That's why, nutrition and lifestyle changes had not been part of the management of PKD. So we had been studying PKD in the lab, using mouse and rat models with PKD. So those are genetically engineered mice, let's say, that form polycystic kidneys, and then we can study them. I had actually a graduate student in the lab, who has long since graduated and moved on, to another job. But he had the idea to influence what's called mTOR signaling, one of the signaling pathways that we had previously found to be a driver of progression in polycystic kidney disease. He wanted to influence mTOR by just feeding his mice less food. mTOR is actually one of the master sort of metabolic regulators. So it gets its signals from growth factors, but also from the nutrient status of cells.
And mTOR is basically an anabolic signal, right? More mTOR signaling means more growth.
Yeah, pretty much. Exactly right. So if a cell is well fed, has lots of nutrients, you get, high mTOR activity. If you starve a cell, you get low mTOR activity. And, my student thought, okay, let me starve the whole mouse, which is not something I would have thought would work. So he actually just did the experiment without asking me, and I would have advised against it. I would have said, you're wasting your time. That's never going to work. But he just did it. So he put mice with PKD on a reduced food intake regimen, and not even anything dramatic. It was only like a 23% reduction in food intake. So it's not even starvation or anything.
But it's a solid diet, a solid restriction, but not starvation.
Exactly right. Yeah. And so then he came to me one day and said, hey, I did this, food restriction experiment, and, the mice are happy and healthy, and, they had normal body weight gain. The everybody was completely happy. The only thing that was different was that the mice in the food restriction arm, their kidneys didn't grow anymore, right? So their polycystic kidneys did not progress. So, and it was a pretty dramatic result, very strong efficacy there. So, we looked at the signaling pathways, and yes, indeed, mTOR was turned down, and, lots of other pathways, fibrosis was inhibited, and so on. So we put this paper together, we published, and we said, hey, food restriction works, and we have no idea why it works. So at the time, we didn't quite really understand how this could have worked. But then we, we try to figure out what's actually going on, what is the mechanism. And another observation was from my student who then told me, just like almost like on the side, oh, by the way, these mice on the food restricted regimen, they eat all their food within an hour. And the way these food restriction experiments had always been done in mice is you have your ad libitum fat control group, right? So these mice live in their cage and they have like a mountain of food, and you just weigh the food, once a day, so you can calculate how much they ate. But they have constant 24/7 access to food. And then you calculate, how much food should you give to the food restriction animals, and you just pre-weigh the amount of food, you put it into the cage once a day. But that completely changes the feeding behavior of these mice. So the ad libitum fat mice, they just like nibble all day long and all night long. The food restriction mice, however, they realize, oh, there's only food coming once a day. I better eat it all right now, before someone takes it away. And they actually consume their breakfast, lunch, and dinner all in one sitting.
So you inadvertently are creating mice that engage in intermittent fasting.
Exactly. Right. So for like 1 hour they eat, and then for 23 hours they fast. And because mice are tiny, during these 23 hours of fasting, they get into ketosis. So, that may not happen quite that dramatically in humans. We have lots of energy stores, so mice don't have these long-term energy stores. So once we realized that, we measured ketone level and said, oh yes, they are in ketosis. And then we put them into ketosis different ways, using a ketogenic diet, for example. And we got the same result. But mice on a ketogenic diet that are not even calorie restricted, they eat the same amount of calories, but their kidneys didn't grow, and their kidney disease didn't progress.
So you kind of stumbled into this by happenstance. It sort of, at first it seemed like it was food restriction that could be driving this effect on the kidneys, preserving kidney function, not progressing in the disease state, but it was actually ketosis. So you can do intermittent fasting to induce ketosis. You can give them a ketogenic diet to induce ketosis without restricting their calories, and you get the same result.
That's exactly right. And then someone in the lab even suggested, the main ketone that is made during fasting is called beta hydroxybutyrate, or BHB. That's normally made by the liver. So somebody in the lab said, why don't we just feed these mice the beta hydroxybutyrate and see what happens
on a non-ketogenic diet?
Right, exactly. Just on a normal rodent chow. And, rodent chow is always a very high carb diet. So again, I wouldn't have thought this would work, but I said, okay, fine, go ahead and do it if you want. And it turns out it actually worked. So you could mimic the benefits of a ketogenic diet by just simply supplementing this one ketone in the drinking water. I just put BHB into the drinking water, and you have the same kidney protective effect. So that was pretty striking, and so we published all these results, and the paper actually made a big splash in the field. So people started to wonder what's going on, and has sparked a lot of clinical studies now also.
So it looked at first like calorie restriction was having this beneficial effect for the kidney. It turned out that it was the induction of ketosis, which you can do either by restricting how much the animal eats or when it's eating, or by giving it a ketogenic diet, a high fat, low carb diet, or you can do it without ketosis, basically without a ketogenic diet. You can simply give BHB in the drinking water, giving them an otherwise fairly high carb diet, and you get the same effect. So it's BHB in particular that seems to be driving this.
Right. Exactly. So now the question is still, what does BHB actually do? And that's something we have been working in the lab. But on the other hand, if something as simple as BHB has a beneficial effect, who cares why it's working, right? Essentially,
yeah. Clinically, maybe you should just be giving certain people with kidney problems BHB.
Right, and that's actually what we ended up doing. So as you may know, BHB in the US you can buy it as a supplement. It's fairly inexpensive. You get it on wherever, Amazon, in all kinds of different products. And people people with PKD were emailing me and saying, "Hey, which BHB product should I buy?" On Amazon. And I always told them, "Oh, wait a second. These are supplements that have all kinds of other stuff in them. I can't recommend any of them." But a group of people that I knew that actually had PKD and were sort of industry professionals, we came together and we decided to launch a company. So a startup company out of the university to essentially put something together that is kidney safe and contains beta-hydroxybutyrate, and is something that we could recommend. And that's exactly what we did. And we actually sort of made use of the fact. So we had another sort of discovery in the lab, but we had started out by talking about these microcrystals. And what we found is if we actually inhibit microcrystal formation, you can greatly improve the progression of polycystic kidney disease, again, in these rodent models. And the best way of inhibiting calcium microcrystals is by supplementing with citrate, citric acid. And the reason is that citrate is actually the natural defense of our kidneys against calcium oxalate crystal precipitation. Because the citrate, has can chelate calcium, so it kind of wraps itself around the calcium and prevents the calcium from ever seeing the oxalate. So it prevents the calcium oxalate formation, which means the kidney can then harmlessly pee out all the oxalate and all the calcium without ever forming calcium oxalate microcrystals. And of course, and we can do this in animal models. We put the citrate into the drinking water, and it greatly improves PKD progression. But then we said, all right, so citrate works, BHB works. What if we put them together? So we combined them, and we found that we actually get a synergistic effect. So you get away with a lower dose of beta-hydroxybutyrate and a lower dose of citrate, and you still get the full protective effect. And that allowed us to actually, file for patent, for the university and say, hey, there's synergism here. And that, gave us the chance to actually launch a company based on this technology.
And is there anything different? So is it just plain citrate and plain BHB, or is there any difference between what you've made and, if you just had a bag of BHB and then you had a bag of citrate, could you just take one scoop of one and one scoop of the other one?
You could, but we formulated it in a kind of like a smart way, if you will. So BHB, there's different forms of BHB that you can administer and buy. Maybe the simplest form, if you will, is the BHB salts. So beta-hydroxybutyrate is actually comes from beta-hydroxybutyric acid, and it's an acid, and you don't want to necessarily drink an acid all day long. So the form that is in most supplements is something like sodium beta-hydroxybutyrate, right? So you have a sodium salt But sodium, on the other hand, is bad for kidney disease. If you there's already very strong correlations with between sodium and kidney disease. So we wanted to make sure to make it sodium free, and most of the supplements out there are actually sodium BHB, which is one of the reasons why I couldn't recommend those. So we spread out the cations between potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And sodium free. And the reason for potassium, calcium, and magnesium is that most people are actually relatively deficient in all three. So lots and lots of people in the US are magnesium deficient. That's like one of the most common electrolyte deficiencies. Same for potassium. Most people don't even get nearly enough potassium in their diet. And actually the same for calcium. And then the calcium, if you ingest it, like we said before, it can actually neutralize oxalate from the food. So it kind of acts as has a double beneficial effect if you formulate a product with calcium in it. And then the citric acid, essentially comes in the form of just plain citric acid. And we formulated everything to and it might be too much detail, but we made it so that it delivers what's called 50 milliequivalents of alkaline base. So you essentially add a little bit of alkaline base to your body, and that can help overcome the acidosis that is very common in people with kidney disease. So most people with kidney disease produce too much acid in their body, and the acid has to be excreted through the kidneys. And that makes it so that you end up with a very low urine pH. So you kind of have, a pH of 5, let's say, all day long. And the low urine pH is also, it's not a good thing for the kidneys because it facilitates the crystallization of uric acid microcrystals, and it also facilitates calcium oxalate microcrystals because it inhibits citrate. You want to alkalinize the urine, and that's what the formulation helps to do.
Is this formulation out and available now, and what is it called?
Yes, it's out. It's been on the market for I want to say 3 years-ish or so, and it's called Keto. And so you can probably guess where the name comes from. The keto part is the BHB part, the citra part is the citrate part.
So that's CITRA?
CRT, yes, right, exactly. Right.
Keto. Okay.
Right. Yep. So the reason why we could actually put it out on the market so quickly, usually if you think in terms of drug development, you're talking about like 10 years down the road, right? Yeah. Because in order to get a drug approved by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, you need to show, your phase 1, your phase 2, your phase 3 trials, and the average cost to get a new drug on the market is between $1 and $2 billion, with a B, and it takes say a decade or so to go through all this. So clearly that wasn't an option because you cannot invest $1 billion and then only sell a very cheap thing where all the ingredients are just supplements you can already buy on Amazon. Right? So the economics of this doesn't add up. So it wasn't an option to make this a drug and get this FDA approved. So luckily, the FDA not only regulates drugs, but also foods and supplements and devices. And there's one more category that's called medical foods that most people had never heard of before, including me, before we started all this. And so medical foods, the ingredients have to be essentially approved food ingredients, which, citric acid obviously is an approved food ingredient. You can buy it in every grocery store. Also, BHB is an approved food ingredient in the US. It's, same thing. It's like over the counter, you just buy it. So when we formulated this, we just made sure this would adhere to the regulations of a medical food, and medical foods do not require FDA drug approval because it's not a drug. Which means we were able to put this together fairly quickly and we'll put it out there for people to start have it available. And that's the difference. And that's what enabled us to do this quickly.
Well, yeah. So we've talked about a number of things. So if we sort of boil down all the things you've said into sort of very practical summary for people, if you want to preserve kidney health in general, it appears to be true. The following things appear to be true. High oxalate consumptions from eating things like spinach or peanuts or other plants that contain oxalates, bad. Consuming high amounts of fructose, bad. Consuming high amounts of protein, not bad. That's actually a myth. So a lot of people think that high protein consumption can harm kidney health, but that doesn't appear to be true. There's no clear association between amino acid consumption and kidney health.
Right, yeah.
Pharmaceuticals like ibuprofen are bad.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah, we recently just published a paper that just came out a few weeks ago on exactly that topic. On the kind of the idea, if you take all the things that are bad for kidneys, if you just take them all away, should be no kidney disease left, right? So because all these things trigger kidney disease. Right, we mentioned at the beginning, like 14% of Americans have kidney disease, a huge number. In ancestral times, back in the day when we were hunter-gatherers, the prevalence of kidney disease would have been zero, right? Because that's how evolution works, right? If we as a species had like lots and lots of kidney disease, we would have just gone extinct, and that would have been eradicated. So our hunter-gatherer ancestors, kidney disease wasn't a thing. And for some reason, it went from 0 to 14%, which we have right now. And I think it's just essentially all due to these triggers that we're constantly exposed to all day long. Yeah.
So we're eating constantly. That includes eating a lot of things that have bad stuff in them for the kidneys, like oxalates. And on top of that, we're also frequently and regularly consuming things like ibuprofen or other pharmaceuticals that are just going to add more to the mix in terms of negatively impacting our kidneys.
Exactly.
Fructose.
Yeah. And we're never in ketosis.
Yeah, we're rarely in ketosis.
Exactly right. So a typical, person in the US, you're actively avoiding ketosis by starting your breakfast, with a cereal, and you have your lunch, you have your snacks, you have your dinner and your late night snacks. So you're suppressing ketosis pretty much for the entire life, which means your kidneys are never exposed to beta-hydroxybutyrate. And I actually think that the beta-hydroxybutyrate is really necessary as a renal protective compound. And again, that's something we're studying in the lab. What is the mechanism? Why is beta-hydroxybutyrate renal protective? So we do have some answers. So they're not quite all published yet. But one, thing maybe I can give away is that BHB is actually not only an energy molecule that's burned for energy, right? Which it is, but that's not the only thing it does. It's also a hormone. So it actually acts on the whole body and on many cells in the body through a receptor. There's a whole BHB receptor, and that's a G protein coupled receptor called GPR109A. And that receptor, binds to BHB. It signals through, for a G protein cascade. So we were able to knock out, in mice, to make mice that are lacking this receptor, and we crossed them with mice with PKD mice. Right? So these mice have polycystic kidney disease, and they lack the receptor.
They can't respond to BHB, but they're going to get the polycystic kidney disease.
Right. Yes. And then when we try to treat them with BHB, it doesn't work anymore.
I
Right.
see.
So you do need the receptor suggesting to us that this is actually the hormonal action of BHB that is primarily playing a role here. So it doesn't knocking out the receptor does not completely eliminate the efficacy of BHB. And BHB actually has other effects as well. It's a potent anti-inflammatory molecule, and inflammation has already been shown to drive chronic kidney disease pretty dramatically. So we're looking at other mechanisms as well, and in particular the immune system. I think is going to be very important there. And because we Western humans now suppress ketosis, so our kidneys never get to see beta-hydroxybutyrate anymore, which I think that's a bad thing. And there's one interesting story. You may or may not have heard of SGLT2 inhibitors.
No.
So they're a big class of blockbuster drugs now. They were initially developed for type 2 diabetes, and they now have become a standard therapy for chronic kidney disease as well. And what these drugs do is they inhibit a transporter in the kidney. And once you inhibit that transporter, the kidneys lose their ability to reabsorb glucose. So which means you essentially end up peeing out a lot of glucose, throughout the day. So you're peeing out something like 80 grams of glucose, just getting rid of it. And the glucose, of course, comes from the blood glucose. So these drugs essentially help with the glycemic control. You lower your blood glucose levels. And interestingly enough, they also induce mild ketosis. So if somebody is on an SGLT2 inhibitor, you get some BHB levels coming up. And these drugs are now, ubiquitously used in chronic kidney disease because they do slow down kidney disease quite nicely. But almost nobody realizes that the mechanism why they're working has actually to do with the ketosis. And that was actually shown in a couple of mechanistic mouse papers, where you can do those types of studies. They could show that, if you prevent the formation of BHB, that SGLT2 inhibitors lose their renoprotective effect. Suggesting it's really the BHB that is protecting the kidneys. So
this would be an example of a drug whose pharmacological benefit can be recapitulated to a significant degree by either making a dietary change to promote ketosis and or by simply taking BHB.
Right, exactly. Of course, the makers of those drugs don't necessarily, I can't blame them. They wouldn't want anyone to really know that you could also just replicate everything by putting someone on a ketogenic diet or give them exogenous BHB, because then they would lose their market. And these drugs are very expensive. They generate a ton of income. They're blockbuster drugs right now. So
wow. So there is we don't need to go off the rails here, but this would be one example where some people in the world do not have an interest in the ketogenic diet or something like that catching on more because it would potentially box them out here when it comes to getting this drug into more people's hands.
That might be one reason why it's not very popular amongst, amongst the treating doctors.
Are there any other major things we've missed in terms of consumables, people, dietary components, drugs, other things that negatively or positively impact kidney health?
Yeah. So let me think. I think we've covered a lot of ground. But like you said earlier on, that essentially the treatment of kidney disease is pretty often just backwards, right? So people with chronic kidney disease, then usually not advised to lower the carb and the sugar intake. That's not a thing. They're only given antihypertensive medication, for example, to just medicate some of the symptoms. they're given these SGLT2 inhibitors to, force them to pee out a bunch of the sugar, while you could actually simply tell them, hey, consume 80 grams less sugar a day, and you have the same effect. And that has unfortunately all led to the epidemic of chronic kidney disease. So we're now at 14%, and numbers have been steadily rising, and it kind of like really trails obesity and type 2 diabetes, and things are now moving worldwide as well. The standard American diet is becoming the standard worldwide diet, more or less.
So you said in the beginning, you said basically that some people think it's mysterious that kidney disease is so common and it's increasing, but you think it's quite straightforward. I can imagine that your answer to this whole apparent mystery is just that, well, we're eating the wrong stuff and in the wrong way. We're not getting the benefits of ketosis and BHB, and we're eating too many of the things that are bad for kidney health, including fructose and high carb diets generally, including oxalates and other things that promote these microcrystals.
Exactly. That's what I would say.
Wow. And I didn't even realize that it was this common. More than 1 in 10 people have some kind of kidney disease.
Right. Exactly. It's the number one NCD right now.
Wow. We covered a lot of ground. This is fast. I didn't realize I was going to be this fascinated by kidney biology before I talked to you and discovered your stuff. Anything you want to reiterate that we talked about, or any final thoughts you want to leave people with about the kidney?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes, patients have to start advocating for themselves and even doing the research for themselves. So I would encourage anyone who happens to, maybe hear this podcast and happens to have kidney disease or knows someone with kidney disease to, let them know that maybe there is something they can do about it. Because, still the current therapy, the standard therapy does not prevent progression of chronic kidney disease. It slows it down. But you never really recover with standard therapy. But there are some studies out there now already using ketogenic metabolic therapy in different forms of chronic kidney disease, where people have seen reversal of the disease. People improve their kidney function. We have published a clinical trial on polycystic kidney disease, for example, with a ketogenic diet. It's in collaboration with the University of Cologne. The data were just amazing, and we achieved partial reversal of the disease, which has not been ever seen before with any pharmacotherapy. So I would say anyone who's affected with kidney disease, go out and do some research, and maybe don't take no for an answer. If your kidney doctor says, "Oh, that's hocus pocus," a diet couldn't possibly help you there. I think that it actually can, because the diet is essentially what generates the disease to begin with.
All right. Well, Professor Thomas Weimbs, thank you very much for your time. This was fascinating.
Super. Thank you, Nick.